The world knew Antonio Banderas as the man who could set a screen on fire with a single stare. A Hollywood sensation whose charm felt untouchable, whose voice carried danger, romance, and mystery all at once. He wasn't just another actor climbing through fame. He became the face of rebellion, passion, and cinematic intensity. From swinging swords in the Mask of Zorro to becoming the fearless outlaw audiences worshipped in Desperado, Antonio created characters that refused to die in people's memories. Later, with pain and glory, he peeled away every layer of illusion and exposed something painfully human beneath the legend. But while the cameras captured confidence, another story was unfolding far away from the spotlight. A story built on heartbreak, fear, sacrifice, and wounds the audience never saw. Because behind every standing ovation was a man quietly battling the moments that nearly destroyed him. Moments that forced him to stop pretending he was invincible. Moments that made him question whether fame, applause, and success meant anything when life itself suddenly felt fragile. So what really happened to Antonio Banderas? Why did the man once seen as untouchable suddenly begin confronting mortality, pain, and the terrifying truth hiding behind the image? And why did those closest to him fear the smile the public adored was hiding something much darker underneath? If Antonio Banderas still represents a piece of cinema history in your heart, leave a like for the man who turned suffering into art and transformed every scar into something unforgettable before this story disappears into silence forever. Long before Hollywood knew his name, before red carpets and flashing cameras followed his every move, Antonio was simply a boy growing up in the restless streets of Málaga, Spain. His childhood was far removed from glamour. The neighborhood carried the weight of hardship, where families learned to survive more than they learned to dream. Born on August 10, 1960, during a tense period in Spanish history, Antonio entered a home where discipline ruled quietly and emotions were rarely spoken aloud. His father, José Domínguez, worked as a police officer, returning home exhausted after endless shifts. His mother, Ana Bandera Gallego, dedicated herself to teaching while stretching every small amount of money as far as humanly possible. Their apartment was cramped, cold during winter nights, and filled with the constant pressure of financial struggle. Antonio grew up alongside his younger brother Francisco, both learning early that survival often demanded silence. There were no luxuries, no glamorous future waiting around the corner, only routine, sacrifice, and the hope that tomorrow might somehow feel lighter than today. At night, Antonio would lie awake listening to the heavy sound of his father's boots crossing the floor while his mother worked beneath dim lighting grading school papers late into exhaustion. Those sounds became the soundtrack of his childhood. Years later, Antonio admitted that affection inside their home rarely came through words. Love appeared through endurance, through sacrifice, through parents who kept moving forward no matter how difficult life became. But despite the hardship surrounding him, Antonio discovered one place where he finally felt alive: football. On dusty streets beneath the Spanish sun, kicking a worn ball against broken pavement, he escaped the weight of reality. The game gave him freedom. It gave him identity. By the time he entered his teenage years, football had become more than a hobby. It became his obsession, his future, his only clear path out of poverty and obscurity. Under stadium lights, with adrenaline racing through his body, Antonio no longer felt invisible. He felt powerful, important, needed. Every practice, every sprint, every match carried the belief that he was moving closer to a destiny larger than the cramped walls of his childhood home. For the first time in his life, he believed the future belonged to him. Then everything collapsed. In 1974, one brutal accident shattered not only his leg, but the entire future he had built inside his mind. The injury was catastrophic. Doctors delivered the news with cold certainty. His football career was over before it had truly begun. At only 14 years old, Antonio suddenly found himself trapped inside a hospital room staring at a ceiling that seemed to stretch endlessly above him. Outside those walls, life continued moving without mercy. Other boys kept training, kept running, kept chasing dreams that no longer included him. The silence became unbearable. Days later, when he tried to stand, the weakness in his damaged leg terrified him. It felt as though his own body had betrayed him without warning. He later admitted that losing football felt like watching his identity disappear overnight. Back home, his cleats remained untouched in the corner of the room until one evening his mother quietly picked them up and hid them away forever. Nobody discussed it. Nobody spoke about the pain hanging over the family. At dinner, the silence from his father felt heavier than anger. Outside the windows, he could hear children laughing and chasing a ball through the streets while he sat trapped inside a future he no longer recognized. He refused to cry. He convinced himself men were supposed to endure suffering in silence. So whenever anyone asked how he felt, he answered the same way every time. I'm fine. But he wasn't. Something inside Antonio broke far deeper than bone. Football had been the one thing giving direction to his life. Without it, he no longer knew who he was supposed to become. As months passed, Málaga itself began feeling unfamiliar to him, almost as if the city had erased him from its story. Every street reminded him of the dream he lost. Every sound felt like a reminder that the world kept moving while he remained emotionally frozen. At 15 years old, Antonio Banderas was no longer chasing greatness. He was simply trying to understand who he could become after watching his entire future vanish in a single moment. Antonio's parents could see it happening slowly. The silence, the empty stare, the way their son stopped laughing like he used to. But some pain lives too deep for even family to reach. Years later, Antonio admitted there was a period where he truly believed his life had already ended before it ever had the chance to begin. Then one unexpected night changed everything. Almost by accident, he wandered into a tiny theater hidden inside the restless streets of Málaga. The room smelled of dust and old wood. Weak lights cut through the darkness while the audience waited in complete silence. And in that moment, something buried deep inside him suddenly woke up again. The stage asked for nothing his broken leg could no longer provide. It didn't care about speed. It didn't demand strength. It demanded honesty, emotion, pain, truth. Watching actors pour heartbreak into performance shook something loose inside him. For the first time since the injury, he felt alive again. Antonio would later say the theater didn't rescue him from suffering. It simply gave him a reason to keep breathing through it. The pain remained. The dream of football was still dead. His cleats stayed hidden away like a memory nobody wanted to touch. But the fire inside him refused to disappear. Life, however, had no intention of becoming easier. The stage gave Antonio purpose, but purpose alone could not protect him from the brutal reality waiting outside the theater doors. If he wanted a future, he had to leave everything familiar behind. The warmth of family, the streets that raised him, the final fragile pieces of childhood still clinging to his heart. At only 18 years old, carrying a worn travel bag and a coat too thin for the cold ahead, Antonio boarded a train to Madrid with almost nothing except determination. The city he arrived in during the late 1970s felt cold, impatient, and unforgiving. Spain itself was still struggling to recover from years of dictatorship, and Madrid showed little sympathy for outsiders chasing impossible dreams. Massive buildings swallowed him whole. Rent consumed money he didn't have. Hunger followed him constantly. And the moment he opened his mouth, people heard the Andalusian accent that instantly marked him as someone who did not belong. Not charming. Not unique. Just another poor young man trying to survive in a city already tired of dreamers. Antonio later confessed there were days when hope itself felt heavier than starvation. Winter wrapped around him like punishment. By 19, he was sleeping anywhere he could find shelter. Broken couches. Crowded apartments filled with strangers. Hard rehearsal room floors after everyone else had gone home. Some nights he stayed inside theaters simply because they were warmer than the streets outside. When temperatures dropped, he pulled his coat tighter and endured the cold until morning. Hunger became routine. He stretched tiny amounts of food across several days, chewing slowly while memorizing lines through the pain in his stomach. Rain leaked through the holes in his shoes until his socks stayed soaked for hours. His hands blistered from carrying equipment, painting sets, and cleaning stages after performances ended. It was exhausting, invisible labor, but the humiliation cut even deeper than the physical struggle. Directors dismissed him the moment they heard his accent. Casting agents rejected him without even pretending to care. After one failed audition, Antonio stood alone in a dark hallway while workers shut off the lights around him one by one until he was left completely in shadow. He later admitted there were moments when rejection made him feel as if he no longer existed at all. Every disappointment dragged him back to the same painful memory from childhood. The hospital ceiling. The realization that dreams could vanish without warning. Still, stubbornness became the one thing keeping him alive. In his early 20s, Antonio forced himself into acting classes he could barely afford after exhausting work shifts that left him physically drained. He practiced lines alone in empty hallways beneath flickering lights until his voice shook from exhaustion. Some mornings he woke so weak from hunger he could barely stand properly. Some nights he sat alone outside while rain crashed against Madrid's cold stone streets, wondering if returning home would mean failure or survival. And the truth is, he almost gave up. He almost packed his bags. Almost disappeared back into Málaga before the city completely erased him. Later, Antonio admitted he thought about quitting countless times, but something deep inside refused to let go. Acting had stopped being a career dream. It became survival itself. Then, quietly, everything changed. Inside a tiny experimental theater with broken chairs and buzzing overhead lights, Antonio delivered a performance fueled entirely by desperation, pain, and raw determination. Sitting in the audience that night was a young director named Pedro Almodovar. Unlike everyone else, he didn't focus on Antonio's accent, poverty, or rough edges. He saw the fire underneath. Their first conversation was brief and almost forgettable to anyone else. But that moment became the crack that finally opened the door Antonio had spent years desperately pushing against. Madrid had humiliated him, starved him, and nearly destroyed his confidence completely. But he survived it. And eventually, the same city that once treated him like a nobody could no longer ignore his name. But the silence surrounding Antonio didn't disappear when he became successful. It followed him all the way to America. In 1992, at 32 years old, Antonio Banderas arrived in Hollywood to film The Mambo King's unable to speak English fluently. Back in Spain, he had already become a respected leading man. In Hollywood, none of that mattered. Suddenly, he was reduced to uncertainty all over again. Language became a wall standing between him and the future he desperately wanted. Antonio later admitted he wasn't memoizing words in English. He was memoizing sounds. Every night, he stood alone in front of hotel mirrors repeating dialogue phonetically, carefully studying his own mouth movements like a stranger trying to steal another identity. Sometimes he stopped halfway through sentences, terrified not of making mistakes, but of people hearing him fail publicly. The fear consumed him quietly. In lonely hotel rooms where the hum of air conditioners became louder than human conversation, Antonio often picked up the phone to call his parents, only to hang up before they answered because he didn't want them hearing the sadness hiding in his voice. Some nights he stared out over Los Angeles from his hotel window while endless headlights moved through the darkness below, wondering whether this city would ever truly accept him. He ate meals alone while whispering English phrases to himself between bites until his throat tightened from repetition. On movie sets, panic followed him everywhere. Every sentence felt like a test. Every silence felt dangerous. Antonio later confessed he felt like a child learning how to walk while the entire world waited to watch him fall flat on his face. The confidence Spain once gave him slowly disappeared piece by piece inside America. But Antonio refused to surrender to embarrassment. Through films like Philadelphia, Interview with a Vampire, and Desperado, he forced himself to remain uncomfortable until fear lost control over him. He rehearsed dialogue inside elevators, practiced lines in taxis, whispered scripts under his breath moments before cameras started rolling. Slowly, he stopped apologizing for his accent, stopped treating silence like weakness. Then came 1998. The Mask of Zorro exploded across the world, earning more than $250 million globally and transforming Antonio Banderas into an international superstar. The same man once terrified to speak English was suddenly carrying one of Hollywood's biggest films on his shoulders. But massive success always demands a hidden price. The role pushed his body to its limit. Endless sword training ripped open the skin on his hands. Horseback rehearsals bruised his ribs and damaged his back. Metal swords clashed for hours until the sound echoed inside his ears long after filming stopped. At night, Antonio washed blood from his hands while flexing stiff fingers before interviews so cameras wouldn't notice the pain. Some evenings he collapsed onto dressing room floors still wearing costume boots, too exhausted to even move. He later admitted it was one of the most physically brutal experiences of his entire career. Yet despite worldwide fame, luxury hotels, and deafening applause, the loneliness remained strangely untouched. Airports blurred together. Hotel rooms felt empty. Crowds screamed his name while silence waited for him the moment the lights disappeared. And then failure returned. In the early 2000s, Ballistic, X vs. Sever collapsed at the box office. Critics destroyed it. Hollywood meetings suddenly became shorter. Smiles became colder. One afternoon after leaving a studio office in California, Antonio stepped outside into bright sunlight and realized something chilling. Nobody had followed him out. The conversation was over. The hallway behind him had already moved on without him. For a brief moment, he stood there feeling that same old silence pressing against his shoulders again. But this time, he understood it differently. Silence no longer terrified him. He had lived with it too long. Instead of breaking, Antonio adapted. Broadway reminded him how to be vulnerable again. Voice acting allowed him to rediscover joy without pressure. Then Puss in Boots unexpectedly became a worldwide phenomenon worth over $500 million, proving he didn't need to reinvent himself completely to survive. He only needed patience. But the deepest emotional chapter of his life arrived years later in 2019 through Pain and Glory. At 59 years old, Antonio stepped into the role of a filmmaker haunted by illness, memory, aging, and regret.
There were no masks this time. No swords.
No action scenes hiding emotion beneath spectacle. Only honesty. Antonio later admitted it was the closest he had ever come to exposing his real soul on camera. Every quiet pause carried decades of pain underneath it. Every look felt painfully real. The performance earned him his very first Oscar nomination, not because he appeared powerful, but because he finally allowed the world to see his vulnerability. Antonio Banderas spent decades convincing the world he was fearless. On screen, he fought villains, survived impossible battles, and carried the confidence of a man nothing could break.
But real life forced him into a battle no movie script could prepare him for.
In 2017, everything changed when a sudden heart attack nearly ended his life forever. One moment he was enjoying a quiet afternoon, and the next, he was struggling to breathe while fear closed around him like darkness. For the first time, the legendary Hollywood icon came face to face with the terrifying truth that fame, success, and applause could not protect him from mortality. That experience shattered something inside him, but it also awakened something deeper. The man who once chased non-stop success began slowing down and seeing life differently.
Family mattered more. Peace mattered more.
Even silence carried meaning now. When Antonio later appeared in Pain and Glory, audiences weren't just watching a performance. They were witnessing a man exposing his real pain, vulnerability, and survival on screen. Behind every quiet stare was someone who had looked death in the eyes and returned changed forever. And perhaps that became his greatest role of all, not pretending to be invincible, but finally admitting he never truly was. Loss does not ask for permission. It arrives quietly. And when it does, it leaves a silence that even greatness cannot fill. For Antonio Banderas, that silence came not from fame or failure, but from the people who shaped him long before the world ever knew his name. His father, José Dominguez, was the structure of his childhood in Málaga, a disciplined police officer whose presence filled the home with order and quiet authority. Antonio grew up learning strength through observation, watching his father return home each day with tired steps but unbroken posture. When José's health began to fade in the late 2000s, Antonio noticed the smallest changes first, but life kept moving, as it always does. Then one ordinary day in 2008, the call came.
His father was gone.
He was in an airport when he heard the news, surrounded by motion while his world collapsed in stillness. On the flight home, he didn't speak. At the funeral, grief didn't arrive as noise, but as weight. The touch of the casket, the sound of earth falling, the memories of a man who had always stood firm. He later admitted the hardest part wasn't the loss itself, but the unfinished conversations that would never happen again. Years later, in late 2017, that same silence returned with his mother, Ana Bandera Gallego. If his father was discipline, she was warmth. A teacher who turned struggle into hope and always told him that when life closes a door, you build another one. He rushed to her side as her health declined, refusing distance, refusing delay. He held her hand in her final moments, feeling life leave the room in the quietest way imaginable. At her funeral, he did not break loudly. He stood still, as if movement might make the loss final in a way he wasn't ready to accept.
But acceptance came anyway. Slowly, painfully.
After both parents were gone, success felt different. Awards, premieres, applause, none of it could replace the empty spaces they left behind. Even in his brightest moments, there was always a chair missing in the audience of his life.
But grief did not destroy him. It refined him.
He began to live more slowly, speak more carefully, and appreciate presence in a way fame never taught him. Málaga became more than home. It became memory, grounding, and meaning. Today, Antonio Banderas carries their absence not as an open wound, but as guidance. And in every quiet moment, he still listens for them, not in sorrow, but in gratitude for everything they made him before the world ever knew his name.